Then. So welcome to the Applied Linguistics and TESOL online seminar series put forward by the UCL Center for Applied Linguistics. And of course, we've moved our seminar series online, which has the great perk of being able to welcome people from around the world to the series. Usually we would get quite a lot of people coming to London, which is a major international hub, but an even wider outreach through this talk. So we're very grateful to have Professor Constance Leung here from King's College London, who's a full professor of educational linguistics. And Constance and I, as we said, had been talking about having you come over to give us a talk, Constance, for many, many months. And, you know, we had to delay it in light of the pandemic. So it's in a slightly different format than we'd thought, but I'm sure it will be wonderful. So just a little bit of background before I hand over to Constance. Constance has extensively contributed to many different areas within applied linguistics. And you might have heard the very different areas that interface in terms of this talk. Constance was talking about rhetoric, English as a second and additional language, classroom teaching, curriculum development, language assessment, academic literacies, language policy, and there are other areas too. Academic writing certainly also interfaces strongly with this topic. So you see that Constance has a very varied portfolio in terms of research interests and is also very good at bringing together different, you know, literatures, you know, where academic communities often function in silos and bringing those together in quite thought-provoking publications. I always find, Constance, that your work challenges tacit assumptions, which can sometimes be really uncomfortable to think about and sometimes even polarizing in terms of, you know, stating what you think we should be considering. For example, in reference to large-scale standardized tests, which I know you'll be talking about in reference to academic writing in your talk today. So Constance also has extensive editorial work in terms of service to academic journals. He's a founding member and current co-editor of Language Assessment Quarterly, editor of research issues for TESOL Quarterly, and he's on the editorial board of Modern Language Journal, having previously served on the editorial boards of many other journals. And Constance is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So we're delighted to have you here, Constance. I mean, at least online and in this forum. And we just a couple of housekeeping bits here, and then we'll hand over to Constance, which is that we are recording the talk, and we've decided that the best format in light of the you know, great attendance here is to have you please type in any questions or comments in the text box, and then at the end of the talk, I'll read those out and we'll have a discussion with Constance. So Constance will speak for around an hour, and then we'll be able to engage in a full discussion. So please, as and when you have a question, type those into the text boxes. And without further ado, thank you, Constance, and we look forward to your talk very much.
Thank you, Talia. Thank you, Jim, for asking me and giving me the opportunity to discuss and share a few ideas with you. I look forward to the discussion at the end of this. In the meantime, on my screen anyway, I can see John. Hello, John. Are you still in the Netherlands? Good, good. I hope you're well. I'm sure there are many other friends, except that I'm restricted by my screen. I can only see John for some reason. So, okay, here we go. I hope to speak for, as Talia says, about an hour. I hope not to go over that. And in fact, I like to kind of keep it to, you know, as brief as possible so that we can have discussion. So let's see if we can move on. Oh, my screen is frozen. Hang on. Can you see the my PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint, Constance. Can you? Yeah.
Right. Okay.
There we go. Yeah.
It probably takes a bit of time, so I have to allow for this. Okay. So by way of thinking about the focus, I'm really thinking of today. I'm really thinking about university level academic writing as an issue, and of course, I mean, academic writing is not just something that stands alone. It's part of academic language. And this is a huge area, as we all know. I mean, we got journals built on this field, EAP, English for Academic Purposes, and so on. Not to mention all the other areas that that are in many ways directly related to this whole area. Language assessment and testing is one. Notions of literacy and so on is another. And so as I go along today, you see that I'm drawing from quite a diverse set of references, only to make a particular case, and that is to do with the very complex nature of academic writing as part of English for academic purposes. So on the screen right now, you see a lot of front covers of books and a couple of website downloads. So when we think about writing for academic purposes, the kind of research covering this area comes from a whole range of very different traditions, perspectives, and in some cases, perhaps even we could say from different disciplines. So we can see on the left quickly, from the 5-paragraph essay that many of us have been brought up on, to a whole range of approaches, from critical genre analysis, Batia's work, John Swales, who's generally known as, the founding scholar, certainly within the field of applied language studies, of the notion of genre, and corpus linguistics, and of course, many well-known authors such as Ken Hyland and so on have been producing work in this area over many years. So here we are talking about a very rich field with lots of perspectives, all trying to get at something called academic writing. And I think that's the first point of focus I want to draw your attention to. But of course, related to that, there are other areas, such as assessment of academic English. And the work here, I think, is also vast. And you can see at the bottom of the page here that, I've listed quite a few names, but this is only a fraction of the work available. I'm simply wanting to show you that, this area is rich again. Over the last 20 years or so, there's been quite a lot of work looking at the relationship between, for example, test scores and the test taker's subsequent performance in the use of English for academic purposes. Over the time, I think it would be fair to say that without going into great detail, the general tenet is that although there is a relationship between test scores and subsequent performance in the use of English, the relationship tends to be not very strong, and in some of the independent research work, you see a range of findings going from very little, very low levels of correlation, or sometimes they use effect size as a measure and so on, to moderately, low to moderate correlation and so on. So there we're seeing again something that's not all pointing in the same kind of direction of good, no good, high, low, but a range always, okay? And different people have come to different conclusions, and often there's a story behind this kind of, as it were, variability. And if you look at corpus analysis, again, over the time, there's been quite a kind of observable trend, if you like, of showing that in relation to, if you like, register or features of language in writing, academic writing, there's often a kind of a difference, if you like, between the kind of text features register in the kind of text that or test tasks that just test takers are meant to produce in in doing the various tests, whether they're standardized or whether they are institutionally based, and the actual register of the kind of language that students would encounter and would be expected to produce in the course of their actual studies in the disciplines, such as biology or geography or sociology or philosophy or whatever. Okay, so in the round then, what we're seeing is a situation where it is a very big and important issue because academic writing is, and well, remains to be a key site for students to show what they have learned and what they can do. Of course, there are other things such as presenting their work in spoken form or doing posters or increasingly using multimodal means to present their ideas and so on. Of course, there's all of that. But in the main, we are still seeing, if you like, something like the end of term, end of year, the essay and so on, assignment as a key site of demonstrating what they have learned. So it remains very important, an important area for us to think about. And so, folks like Biber, for example, over the years have been sort of showing that there's a difference between what students are expected to actually understand and use in the course of their studies in their disciplines, and the kind of some of the test tasks that they're expected to perform and the language features involved. So what we're basically thinking about here is an area that's immensely rich, but with a lot of very diverse inputs into the exploration, a lot of very different kinds of, as it were, and sometimes uncomfortably contradictory type of findings. And so the question then is, sure, this is a really interesting issue, a very important issue, highly energized, and a very productive field, just looking at the range of published outputs by colleagues in the different areas. But the question then is, why are we seeing so many different accounts and so many approaches, and why have we not, as it were, have a more or less settled view of it? Now, of course, having a settled view of it is, as we know, not just in itself a good thing. It might well be just something that is temporary, but nevertheless, we're not even seeing that. And so there remains an issue. And I suspect the issue is that we are talking about something that is quite knotty. And in the way that we have gone about studying it, we have crossed different fields in different ways, but sometimes not always connecting. And I think this is really perhaps at the heart of the conundrum that I'm trying to get at today. So saying all that then tells me that we got a problem. And in a way, the whole of the sort of academic writing, or even, the field of studying using language for academic purposes is pretty much a work in progress still. And it was interesting to note that the National Academies of Sciences, this is in the United States, a few years ago, 3 years ago, published a long document looking at the various aspects of English as a second additional language, and evaluating where we are, the state of play, and so on. And they've come to the conclusion that while this whole business of academic language, if you like, and they were referring to English in this case, is very important, of critical importance, of course, in relation to both school and university education. But it's been quite difficult to pin it down because the way we have come to study, come to teach, come to explore this whole field is basically, we're drawing from a large range of different disciplines and traditions. And as a result, it's kind of difficult to kind of hold it all together. And they kind of commented that this is clearly something that we need to kind of pay more attention to, because the diversity, if you like, in the approach to the whole issue of academic writing or academic English, if you like, needs some sort of in itself, some sort of coherence, if you see what I mean. And so it's interesting that it's not just my observation, but you know, a group of colleagues in the States have come to this conclusion. So what are we doing here today? Well, I'm trying to understand really what academic tutors, you know, teachers, including ourselves, I suppose, you know, what do we look for in students' writing? Because after all, you know, we, as it were, as tutors, are, in a way, we are the judges. We are teachers, but we're also judges, because when we mark student assignments, you know, we pronounce a judgment, you know, and we give them a mark, a score, and so on. So one way of getting at this is to actually look at what do the kind of key stakeholders, in some sense, the gatekeepers, that's ourselves as teachers, if you like, what do we do? What do we look for? And the kind of points of interest for me would be looking at the expectations of the teachers, and the teachers themselves are representatives of the disciplines, because they enact the discipline as they teach, as they discuss ideas with the students in the seminars and so on. So they are, in some sense, a temporal authority of their discipline when they are teaching and when they are talking with the students in relation to the ideas in their own disciplines. So we're really looking at the way disciplinary content knowledge, if you like, is enacted in a situated kind of way, because, you know, as Talia and Jim are across the road from me, so to speak, at University College, and, you know, we are colleagues, we talk together, but when we teach, we also actually bring something slightly different because of our own background, our own perspectives, our own sensibilities, and so on. So that version of applied linguistics that we represent are also situated and enacted by us slightly differently because of our own, if you like, disciplinary connections and background and so on. So that's the way that I'm trying to work it, okay? And the angle approach is really to look at, in terms of writing anyway, the compositional, if you like, details. What are the elements in a piece of writing that would count for reasonable piece of work? And into that, of course, we now got research in genre theory. We know something about argumentation, which I'll talk about a bit. And also we have a body of work related to the idea of knowledge structures, which would then help us to tap into the content side of it. Now, this is immensely difficult task, I think, not just for me personally, but I think collectively, because when we come to disciplinary knowledge, it's huge, because in all the subjects, they have their own version of their content knowledge. And so how can us studying, if you like, academic writing in relation to students from diverse subject areas, how can we hold that together? So we need something kind of slightly above the actual subject content, but elevating it to a little bit more of an abstraction, but without losing sight of the detail of the content. So that's a very interesting, intricate area of work, I think, that we might need to engage with. And by way of demonstrating that, I'll do a little bit of reanalysis of some student writings drawn from a corpus built by my colleagues at King's, Chris Tribble and Ursula Wingate. I'll do that at the end just by way of illustrating what I'm talking about. So to move on. So writing in the academy, then the writing itself is clearly the text, and the text represents something about the discipline that we are studying or we are teaching. And so on the one side, the way we have gone about this, you know, in relation to, for example, EAP, we have studied, for example, language discourse functions, the stylistics and the pragmatic conventions involved. And of course, there's always the lexical grammatical accuracy issue. So when you think about some of the work that we've seen over the years in relation to academic writing, we see detailed analysis of stuff related to discourse functions, such as citation, how we position ourselves as authors, you know, authorial stance, and there's a body of work related to that. And then there's specific analysis in relation to how arguments are structured in terms of moves. You know, do you start with something to do with a premise and then go on to argue the case with support and then draw a conclusion? And so there are things like that to do with the text level, the textual level of writing. And then of course, stylistically, you know, of course, you know, how far do you insert yourself? Are we basically servants of a discipline? So we do not say, you know, I or we, but and that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot of work related to that. And then the pragmatic functions of, you know, how far do you actually specifically challenge other ideas, or how do you say it, and things like that. So there's work there on the one hand. And on the other, there's obviously the content. And the content has been partly covered in a lot of the thinking that we are doing when we say, well, how do people cite work and how do they reference? Of course, then that's related to content. But when we talk about content in that sense, whether we are invoking appropriate ideas and so on, we're not really addressing sufficiently, in my view, the actual disciplinary knowledge itself. We're talking about the way that content may be presented, may be invoked, may be used in a piece of writing, but not the actual engagement with the content itself. And I think that's an area that needs articulation. And the way I'm saying it right now may not even be a very effective way of pinpointing that precise area where content has to be addressed and not just regarded as some sort of features of representation or presentation, okay? And then of course, as I hinted at this earlier, as teachers, we are in some sense representatives of our disciplines, but we are not all the same. So even if we were teaching the same topic in the same subject area, we might still be slightly different or very different. And so therefore there's a question of intellectual sensibilities. You know, some of us are more oriented towards one kind of approach or the other, and so on. And then there's of course, additionally, institutional constraints that we have to take into account. So for example, how far, we're giving a lot of seminar time, workshop time in our teaching program, or are we meant to be delivering most of our teaching through lectures and, sort of, if you like, in big presentations rather than in smaller group tutorials and so on. So there are all kinds of things impacting on this. So the question is, how do we kind of bring them together? Now, I'm not pretending for one moment today that I'm bringing everything together, in this discussion, not at all. All I'm trying to say is there may well be all kinds of things that we need to get hold of a bit more. So at the moment, the issue seems to be that the rub is academic writing is actually quite hard to get hold of, just as academic language itself. And it's something that still slightly mysterious. In fact, Teresa Lillis a few years ago wrote a piece and referring to, if you like, the kind of university essay as a kind of practice of mystery, you know, signaling that students are forever, you know, left in, you know, in the dark, not quite sure what is expected and how do you get there to get this, you know, really excellent kind of piece of work, you know. So there's constantly a sort of a bit of unknown in this. Okay. So let's go with the idea of genre first. Now, I know that the field is very rich and very diverse, and you know there are different schools of thought and so on. So I'm not really going down that particular path. I'm not going to be partisan about this. I'm simply going with, if you like, Swell's idea that it is essentially a way of a group of people who share the same discipline, the way they talk about things, the way they write about things, and the way they do that would have a certain kinds of pattern, and in some sense, the community coming together, a group of historians, a group of philosophers, a group of engineers, if you like, coming together, sharing their work, exchanging ideas, critiquing each other's ideas, and so on. They all come together with performing their, if you like, the activities with some sort of recognizable pattern. And that is then, if you like, part of the reason that we tend to see, for example, arguments coming from different disciplines share a certain kind of, if you like, commonality, so that other people recognize that this is an argument, this is a rebuttal, and so on and so on. Okay, and so I'm really talking about a kind of community that that share similar ideas, and the community itself, the members themselves, adhere to certain kinds of practices in the way they talk, the way they write, the way they present the work, and that's the broad sense of genre that I'm taking today. Okay, so it's really about, if we are really talking about a subject, a discipline, then it is to do with the practitioners of those subjects and disciplines practicing their business, their discipline. Okay. And you can see, I again, just by way of just showing the, you know, the richness of the field, you know, the list of names, authors who've done work. But in fact, I mean, you know, the journals themselves are a very rich source of this kind of information. Plenty of work there. Okay, my colleague, Ursula Wingate at King's talks about writing coming at the end as a sort of at the end product of a complex literacy process. And I think that's a really interesting thought, because what seems to me is that although, you know, students write and teachers write and so on, right through their engagement with the discipline, the key moment is really perhaps the kind of assessment assignment, the end of year, end of term, end of module assignment. And so in that sense, I think it's quite a neat way of capturing that idea. But of course, to get there, you need to have done the study, to have done the module, to have attended the lectures, and, you know, to have read a few books and articles and so on. So it's a process, really. And the process is, in some sense, a literacy process. Well, that's right, because the written language is involved, but of course, spoken language is part of it. So, you know, what we're talking about is this process, if you like, is in fact a kind of recursive chain of activities. They don't really need to kind of, you know, be sequence in the sense of, well, you do, you know, the first thing first and then the last thing last. In fact, people kind of go back on themselves, you know, they read something and they've written something and then they didn't like it and they go back to the beginning and so on. So there's a kind of repetition, recursive activity and so on going on with this kind of activity. So, but in essence, what we're talking about is the student as the apprentice, if you like, coming into contact with disciplinary concepts, ideas, stocks of knowledge, data in the discipline for the various topics and subjects. And you know, research methods, particular kind of approaches to inquiry. These are all very much related to the the discipline, the content of the discipline that that the student would be engaged with. And then there is the gradual, if you like, development of a kind of knowing of the discipline, what is worth knowing, what is not, what counts as a good argument, what counts as not, that sort of thing. And that's mediated by the curriculum of, you know, obviously influenced by the teachers involved and the teaching activities themselves. And then the student would have to then do some work either by themselves or with other fellow students and with the help of the tutors and so on. But in the end, the student would have to engage with some sort of choosing, some sort of evaluation of what counts as relevant for their own work, for their own writing, and then present what they think to be worthwhile in an assembled message, the essay, if you like, or the report. And this assembled message has to be presented in what we loosely refer to as logical and coherent argumentation. And that is, it has to, in some sense, conform to the expectations of the discipline as enacted by the tutors, by the teachers. And so it's a kind of complex process. It's not one thing by itself. In order to get to the writing stage, or well, basically, in order to understand the discipline, you've got to do a lot of things, the kind of things that I just described. And so in a way, the writing part of it is an attempt to capture what it is that you have got from what you have learned. So the important thing is to think about, you know, what is, you know, what should be displayed in that text. Okay, that text could also be obviously spoken text, because increasingly we encourage our students to be able to present their ideas, you know, in a spoken form and in, you know, using PowerPoints and so on. So that's one part of it, you know, the idea that people do things together as a kind of community, and getting to be an effective writer, you have to be attuned, as it were, to the sensibilities and to the stock of knowledge in your own discipline. But of course, then we say, well, you've got to present it logically. Well, what's logical? Well, we also know that, for example, certainly in the kind of academy, in the global north anyway, we tend to think of, if you like, something logical that has a particular kind of internal structure. Well, this is in itself a huge field. So for today, I think all I can do is to kind of cover, if you like, a couple of aspects of it. One area of reasoning in disciplines, that is, you know, how you prosecute your argument and how you demonstrate that what you say is correct and what support you use. So reasoning, I think, is what we're talking about. And one way of demonstrating your reasoning is obviously by way of formal logic. And of course, that itself, for folks today who have done maths would know that, you know, mathematical reasoning has quite a lot of theories and programs of thought that are held to be, if you like, right and correct, and then they can be the premises for further thinking and development of arguments, so on. That's one kind. And the other is obviously the work associated mainly in the early days, but increasingly, you know, being developed by lots of other people, but Toulmin's work. So I'll just cover these two very quickly. Well, syllogism, of course, is one way of thinking about formal reasoning. And, so the classic there is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So what we're seeing here is fundamentally two premises, two propositions. All men are equal. Socrates is a man. And from there, you deduce that Socrates is mortal because Socrates is a man. And of course, you can use the same reasoning and apply in other areas. So here's one. All musical instruments make sounds. Motorbikes make sounds, so therefore motorbikes are musical instruments. So there you are, you have a somewhat ridiculous conclusion, as it were, built on two premises. But that just shows you how that might just work. Now, this is a very, very skimpy kind of representation of that thought, but obviously I'm trying to kind of demonstrate that there's an issue here, and here's a bit of a joke. I shan't comment. Okay, right. The other end of the story, I think, would be the informal logic of argument as presented by Tumin. But of course, as you see from the references I've given, I mean, there are lots of other references, but it's been developed. But primarily what we're talking about is, instead of using formal logical argument, we are actually pitching into much more everyday experience and talk about argumentation as containing elements. So to make a good argument in Tumin's representation of this, you need to have certain elements, the components, if you like, of making that argument. So to go quickly, the six elements are the claim, that is what you claim something to be, if you like, the data, and that is, the kind of information that you have to build your, as it were, your claim. The warrant, that is what gives you the authority to say something is so. The backing is further support for the warrant. Qualifiers are, if you like, literally qualifications where there may well be some margin of, as it were, uncertainty, and that you need to kind of state that in your argumentation. And of course, you also have to give space for rebuttal, that is to deny the claim. Okay, and this approach, I think, has permeated across many of the academic fields that we know of, and it's been extremely influential in the way that we, as it were, come to argue our case. I would say across the range, across the curriculum in the academy. Okay, so to give you a sort of sense of what we're talking about is some of these elements, some aspects of these elements feel general because you can apply the claim, data, warrant, backing, qualifiers, rebuttal to almost every area of argument that we can imagine in the academy. But actually what goes into those claims and what those data points might be and what the warrants might be would be specific to the discipline. So what you then have is a situation where, very neat sort of way you can say the 6 elements are field general, but what goes into those elements and what is taken to be, if you like, what constitute those elements are actually discipline specific, there to do with the subject area that you're studying. Okay, so let me just illustrate this by way of an example of the data, warrant, and so on. So what you see, the D, the capital letters in the inside the brackets are to do with the 6 elements. So data. Sam was born in Sydney. Then we have a claim. Sam is an Australian, has Australian nationality. Qualifier would be presumably, because there may well be some exceptions to the rule, okay, for now. So you have data, you have qualifications, you have a claim. The warrant for saying that Sam has Australian nationality is that since everyone born in Australia is an Australian, well, that's a warrant. Well, who said so? The backing for that warrant is that, well, the legal statutes in Australia and the way, you know, the statutes have been operated in the legal system in Australia. So therefore, you then have a piece of data, a claim that the data is something justifiable through the warrant and the backing. But of course, it may not be true. So what would be the grounds of rebuttal? Well, it may well be that both of Sam's parents were not Australian citizens or permanent residents, possibly at the time of Sam's birth. And so you can see in a very skeletal form, the sort of argumentation that we come across all the time. But you know, obviously, we're not talking about Sam being born in Sydney. We're talking about something in, you know, in history, in geography, you know, in philosophy and in marketing or whatever. Okay, so there, I think the most interesting point is the two-main type of argument actually allows you to look at something that is across the piece, but also very specific to the discipline. And I think it's very interesting there. Another area that I think might be of help to us, and that is to do with this idea of knowledge structures. Now, I'm drawing from the work of Bernie Moen, and this piece of work was first developed in the 1980s, and it's, you know, in some sense being worked on still. But, anyway, the idea is this, that across the various subject areas in our curriculum, in a broad sense, there are certain knowledge structures that are underpinning the actual information and the knowledge that we work with, okay? And now, of course, very quickly, I can only deal with the headline, as it were, issues here. Just think about how often we describe something across the different subject areas. So we can describe the bodies of animals, types of trees, types of gases, describe different, for example, environmental models and so on. So what we're talking about is describing is in itself a very common and almost universal piece of activity in the academy. And it happens in almost every subject area. So you describe someone in, you know, well, writing a novel or reading a novel, you come across description of characters, situations, and so on. You get it in history, describing a situation that, you know, that led to, for example, well, the Second World War, for example, and things like that, okay? And in the description of something, you actually lay the basis for other work to do with, for example, classification. So just as you can describe different kinds of trees, and then you know, the description of the different kinds of trees would then provide a pathway to classifying different kinds of trees as different kinds of, you know, mammals and that kind of thing. And then of course, characters in literature, ideas in different subject areas, in history, geography, you know, describing different kinds of soil, for example, in either geography or chemistry and that kind of thing. Describing is the actual, if you like, classroom level discussion activity we do. The actual outcome of description provides the pathway to classifying things, to categorizing things, and so on. So there's a higher level thinking behind the description. And another area is sequence. So in history, we have, we have sequence of events, let's say event 1 leading to event 2, and eventually coming to some sort of consequence of events 1 and 2. Event 3 is a sequence of consequence. So in the let's say in economics, you can actually talk about the events leading up to the abandonment of the gold standard in the first part of the 20th century. And what are the economic conditions? You describe the conditions there in this place and that place, leading to, if you like, the final crash of, the so-called gold standard in the world economy. So you have sequence in history, you have sequence in, well, obviously in novels, you have sequence from, telling a story is a sequence. Doing an experiment in science is a sequence. You have step 1, step 2, and so on. So there, suddenly, by engaging with looking at sequencing of events, that in itself opens the pathway to explaining cause and effect, allow you to generalize because, certain sequences are the same. And, if that's the case, you can generalize on something. And of course, there's whole business of doing experiments, which we hold to be very important as part of, scientific activity. Well, experimenting is also a sequence. The sequence itself is key to experimenting. So again, sequence itself is a very interesting area. And the final area would be choice and evaluation. Now, of course, in a lot of areas of our work, we have to identify a solution. Just remembering, for example, doing kind of school science, we play with, certain kinds of equipment to sort of say, well, what works, what doesn't work. So, thinking about my own school science or playing with electricity circuit boards, you play with different kinds of switches. And some switches work, some don't, and you make a choice and that kind of thing. And as a result, you end up saying, well, switch A is better than switch B because it works and so on. So you're making a choice. In our study, we actually end up with evaluating. So evaluation, of course, is everywhere too.
You should postpone that scan. Choose the next option down.
Choose the next option down. Sorry, Jim, what did you say?
Your computer's going to run a scan at 1 p.m. in 9 minutes.
No, I know that one. It runs in the background.
All right, no worries.
Right. It comes up every day for some reason. Right. Okay. So so what we're talking about here is there are certain, if you like, structures in our academic content, if you like, in the disciplines that we can get hold of, but these structures are slightly above the actual substantive content. So we're not really just talking about a specific piece of content related to, for example, the crash of the gold standard or the electric circuit board. But these ideas, these, if you like, relationships that we're looking at in our academic work can actually be quite helpful. And I'll try to demonstrate that in a moment, okay? So we are saying that there are essentially some genre issues to do with community kind of shared sentiments and so on and practices. There is something cross-curricular about argumentation, and we've seen that in Tumin's work, Tumin's and others. And there are certain things that can help us see, if you like, patterns structures underneath the substantive pieces of knowledge that we deal with. That's the Mohan knowledge structure. So, oh, looks like my screen has, right. Okay, sorry. So there you are. It's a kind of a pictorial representation of what I've been talking about. And I think what's happening here is these three areas may not work independently. And in fact, I think there's every chance that they are actually gearing together in a very complex way that we don't fully understand yet. Okay, but I think we have the beginnings of some sort of understanding if we can look at these three areas in relation to what actually happens, okay, which is I'm turning to. So in other words, I'm talking about three areas that should come together in some analyzable way so that we can begin to kind of demystify, if you like, the kind of complexities and the diversity in the way that we think about academic writing, as pointed out by the National Academies, the piece that I referred to earlier. So here's a piece of work here. And this is a piece of data drawn from Triple and Wingate. And what I'm doing is a little bit of reanalysis. Now, what you're seeing here is a piece of writing from a student in business studies. And the title is to do with something called service dominant logic. And what it means is this is a particular kind of thinking in marketing, in the study of marketing anyway, an ideology that emphasizes the centrality of firm consumer cooperation when they innovate and produce new products. So in other words, it's a kind of working with the consumer and so on, okay? So the student writes, as explained by Vargo and Lush, the reasoning behind SDL, service dominant logic, dates back several decades when resources started to include intangible components such as knowledge and skills. Although abstract, these new resources have been viewed as increasingly significant to the development of marketing. So a kind of claim has been made by the student, okay, that SDL is sort of very important, and is and although it's relatively kind of new, but it's very important. The tutor, marking the essay, wrote, against this particular point, which resources, products, market, and so on, okay? So what are we seeing here? I think what we're talking about here is something like the coming together of the three elements that I've been talking about. So this is an enactment by the tutor of the tutor's own knowledge representation of the discipline that they are talking about. And the content of that knowledge is now being rendered and acted in a live form in the comments, okay? So I would argue that the tutor's questions can be seen as indicating a problem with, for example, related to two-means data and claim, because the claim related to SDL is not supported by adequate data, okay? So there's a kind of, well, you're not really showing, you're just making a claim, you're not showing, what the data is, okay? These questions can also be seen as pointing to the inadequacy of the description, the Mohan notion of description. Because in a way, if you're describing or talking about something called SDL, you need to provide a description. And yet, by not saying anything, but simply saying, well, it's increasingly important and so on, and that sort of thing, you are kind of not really doing your job in the discipline. And that actually is related to some sort of genre sensibility. And that sensibility can only come from someone within the discipline because the judgment here by the tutor is that I am, as it were, more expert than you, the student. And I'm telling you that, within our discipline, if you talk about something like this, you need to provide a lot more detail in the description. okay? And so there you have it. You might have a kind of formal category called description, but whether it is actually necessary to really go into any kind of detail or not at all, I think would still be subject to the genre sensibility. But that in itself is not a fixed thing. It's related to the enactment of that membership of being an expert community, okay? So that's one example. Another example would be another piece here from history now. And here the student writes, and this is to do with the Chartist movement in British history. So from 1832, the Chartist movement grew and grew, delivering petitions to Parliament with over 1 million signatures, holding mass rallies, national conventions where audience was large enough on occasion to require 8,000 troops to be deployed along with the enlistment of thousands of special constables. So we're talking about a moment in history, okay? And that, and the event itself is a description of, you know, lots of people signing a petition, 1 million people, and then, you know, some sort of that demo, basically, with lots of people coming, and the authorities call for the policing of this event, requiring 8,000 troops and then lots of special police officers. The tutor's comment against the footnote 9, okay? The footnote says the starting point of the movement that Stedman Jones ascribed. So the students actually making a footnote of who said about this. The tutor's comment there says, I don't think you need to footnote this. This is very interesting because the tutor is saying the student is trying to provide some detail. In other words, for description. The tutor says, well, you don't need to say this. Very interesting point. And related to the issue of the 8,000 troops, the calling on 8,000 troops to police the event, the tutor says, could these troops be an overreaction by the state in response to the perceived threat? So here we have a very, very interesting moment of saying, well, someone just simply making a statement, but that statement has taken to be something else. That is something like, are you really sort of, drawing a conclusion here, justifying something, that kind of thing. So let's see. So the tutor's comment on footnote number 9 suggests that it is unnecessary. It's a detail that's not needed here because implicitly the tutor is saying everybody knows this. Well, how would one know about this? Well, the idea that everybody knows this, meaning everybody in our discipline would know this, so you don't need to say this at this level of study, presumably. But the point about it is, whatever the tutor is pointing out, it is about the discipline, knowledge, and sensibility that being invoked. That is, we don't need you to tell us that everybody knows. Okay, so that's interesting. So this idea of, providing description to support your argument, actually some of it in academic writing, you don't need to do. And the only way you know is to interact with your expert tutor who would then put you right, so to speak. So that's a kind of dynamic dimension to it. And so some of Toulmin's claims may not need to be accompanied by data warrant or backing, Toulmin's backing, if they are already widely accepted or known. So what counts as adequate description, the Mohan scheme, if you like, can also be seen as a sort of contingent on what's being talked about and what counts as commonplace or what's new information. Now, again, that is sensibility. And that cannot come from simply studying the books. It has to be the way that knowledge is assembled in particular ways through, the experts, the tutors, and so on. And the comment on the deployment of the 8,000 troops is related to Mohan's principle of cause and effect and interpretation. And that is, just because lots of people sign a petition and lots of people are due to go to a demo, does it warrant, if you like, the calling up of 8,000 troops? Or is there something else going on? In other words, the argumentation here is also in need of explication, because you can't simply accept what's happened to be, as it were, the only version of reality that doesn't need analysis or critique. So here, again, is a moment of disciplinary sensibility that is directly entangled with the stock of knowledge in this particular discipline, history, and also to do with what counts as needed. And that, I think, is probably in part the kind of mystery that Teresa Lillis was talking about. How do you get to it if you don't actually expose, if you like, the analysis to this sort of dynamic interaction between the hinterland of the disciplinary knowledge, the enactment of it, and the, if you like, judgments made by the experts through their expert sensibility, drawing on expertise within the subject. And so there is a package that needs, I think, quite a bit more work. Looking at the time, I'm over by 5 minutes, so I'll stop in maybe 2. But anyway, so I've taken you through, as it were, a little bit of a kind of a journey into the hinterland, the compositional interior structure of what goes on when students try to, as it were, display their knowledge of the discipline and how they are being judged and what counts as good or bad or effective writing. So what we have then is effectively the argumentation being rendered in one way or the other by the expert knowledge, and that the expert, the knowledge itself can be analyzed in terms of whether it's description or whether it's sequence, and whether if it's sequence, how is it being used? Is it being used to form a general theory or draw a conclusion, and so on. And so therefore, we are really talking about a very dynamic process that would require a bit more understanding. But I hope to have shown enough of what I think could be a productive way of thinking about this, rather than thinking about academic writing as a kind of, a set of texts and all the discourse moves that can come, because, ultimately with that particular approach, we end up with, if you like, specific descriptions or accounts, but not actually accounting for the dynamic nature of the kind of knowledge that's being worked on by tutors and students. And students coming to understand that would need to also appreciate that no amount of reading of books or if you like, learning from other people, from expert texts would allow them to actually transfer what they know into what they do effectively, because there is, if you like, some other mediating process here, and that is the actual enactment of that by the teacher, by the experts, by other experts as they engage with the doing of the discipline as a actual process. So I think at that point, I'd like to stop, because it is 1:05. So over to you, Jim and Talia.
Yeah, thank you, Constant. This is a fascinating presentation. You said at the beginning that this is a tough nut to crack, and I think this is certainly the case. You've given us a great deal of food for thought, and I think we'll go straight to questions and comments. So what I'll do is read them out, and please keep them coming. We've got quite a few to get through. So we have Anna Murawska, who said she's made the point about English for general academic purposes, EGAP, is still more prevalent in the field of EAP compared to ESAP for specific academic purposes. It would seem that the field is moving towards ESAP, and then she cites some brilliant examples or excellent examples of ESAP practice, but that those haven't yet been synthesized or codified, and with some exceptions that you noted at the beginning of the presentation. And she wanted to underscore one, which is research on disciplinary differences in expressing criticality. She points to Ian Bruce's Expressing Critical Thinking Through Disciplinary Text Insights from 5 Genre Studies. Yeah, just wondered if you know that and what you thought of that text at all, Constant.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I don't claim to know everything that's been studied, but I do agree with the general sentiment that instead of looking at and searching for, if you like, a general model for something called academic writing, if you like, or general writing and so on. I think we should perhaps begin to relocate ourselves to much more situated sites and begin to develop, if you like, what is really, if you like, locally expected without infringing or transgressing the broader disciplinary expectations. So in some sense, well, you know, if you actually look at some, you know, Toulmin's ideas, well, if claims on certain data needs warrant to support it, then that is a general, you know, field general issue. But the more specific way of doing it would be the substantive content and how it's being enacted and rendered by the local, if you like, participants. And I think that's the point at which I think I would tend to kind of now begin to say the general model is kind of helpful, but in order to make it work, you got to bring it to emphasize the situatedness of it in the specific disciplinary areas rendered and acted by the stakeholders in a local context. And that context could be you know, particular university program, or could be, you know, a joint program, because after all, you know, there are lots of joint university programs, and so, you know, they may well be local at the level of several universities, or even a whole, if you like, discipline in a particular, you know, well location. But whatever that is, I think we need to empirically develop that rather than kind of built on an abstract sense of what are the basic principles, and therefore you can apply them everywhere.
Thanks, Constant. I mean, I wish you had something ready to go. We are often asked by colleagues from the Academic Writing Center, you know, helping in-sessional students to come up with disciplinary specific stuff. And we, you know, we provide, you know, exemplar assignments and so on and so forth, but it's quite difficult to know how to actually guide them to do something that really is fit for purpose for the discipline and in the ways that you've highlighted here. Do you have any tips, practical rules of thumb?
Well, I think in some sense the you know, the missing piece, and you know, I might even say the elephant in the room, is that the people who ask you for those specific you know, from the different disciplines, asking you for guidance, are themselves part of the answer, because they know what they're looking for. Just as we've seen in the 2 examples that I cited, that they actually know, but they're not possibly theorizing what they know, or maybe it's not something that even occurred to them as a kind of conscious piece of what they do as a professional practice, but they do it. And so therefore, the way to work with that is to actually invite them to maybe simply to show you what they have done in their markings. You know, when they mark term papers, what they say to them, to the students, and through their comments, you can see reflections of their concerns, and that's where it brings the whole thing alive. It is the enactment of their kind of their expert status. You know, they're the gatekeeper of that discipline at that moment. And with their, you know, working with you, you can give their answers back to them.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and that's what we're doing. So that's reassuring, and those examples were quite telling, especially the history one. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. It's from Steve Peters. Hi, Stephen. Is epistemic fluency as a concept useful to help understand the academic skills which play a role in explaining the naughtiness of identifying the what, why, and how of academic writing? Perhaps it is constantly evolving, being reframed, being renegotiated as understandings of knowledge construction are?
Right. I missed one bit of it. Did you say systemic?
It's epistemic fluency,
okay.
which he defines as the ability to move between epistemic frames to use and critique them.
Yes, absolutely. I think there is, over time anyway, this is a very dynamic aspect of the stock of knowledge in all disciplines anyway. We know that from, well, I mean, at risk of crossing another paradigm, the kind of Karl Popper notion of what counts as knowledge, and it's never stable, and it's only as good as it's not being challenged, devastated by other critiques and so on. So yes, of course, the nature of it is constantly being, as it were, renewed through critique and through divergent thinking and so on. So it is not going. There's not going to be as well. I can't imagine an end point in the way that we operate reasoning, and that there's no such thing. I think if we can say we stop at some point because there's no more, we don't need to know anymore, or knowledge has stopped, then I think I can't imagine it. But if it should ever come to that, then there wouldn't be a writing issue anyway, because we wouldn't have a static situation of, knowing what we know and we just apply what we know all the time and we repeat it endlessly until the end of time. I can't imagine it, not in the way that I understand academic work. It will forever be renewed, challenged, and revised, and it will be, as it were, reconceptualized and then rearticulated.
Yeah, so an emphasis on the dynamic nature of this. Next question. So we've got one from Kumar. Sorry for mispronouncing that, which I inevitably did. So it's with regard to assessing the writing of of undergraduate students of English, where it seems there is no specific disciplinary area about which students are supposed to write, and hence no room for genre sensibilities. Should assessment be reduced to issues of text organization?
Wow. Right. I think I understand where that's coming from, because I think with some of the sort of academic language tests, you tend to have. I think I understand this question. You tend to have test items that are, not discipline specific, if you like. So therefore, we're really, talking about something that's quite different. I mean, the sort of thing that I think, people like Douglas Biber have been pointing out for quite some time. So yes, but I wouldn't, quite frankly, I think all the current available assessment instruments actually tap into something. But what they don't do is to tell you the whole story. So I wouldn't sort of throw everything out just like that. But there's no reason why we shouldn't know something about our students, let's just say, ability to use lexis and grammar effectively. There's no reason why we shouldn't do that, because after all, it is there. It is one of the components of writing. But the point I'm trying to sort of to make is, all the efforts by our colleagues in the related fields have all contributed to our understanding, but as the the academies in the States, as they have pointed out, we don't have a picture that is coherent. And I think part of it is because we are all contributing to different bits of it without making any sense of how to link them together, if you see what I mean. So you can look at all sorts of EAP material, And you think that, you know, if you kind of got acknowledgement sorted, or you got a stance sorted, then you got, you know, that part of it done. But actually, it might well be done in one or two, you know, disciplines, but it might not be done in other areas. And so that, you know, there are all kinds of gaps in the current field. So if, you know, whatever you are assessing, whatever you are teaching, if you want to teach a general, a set of general schema for academic writing, well, sure, I can't see why you shouldn't do it, but I wouldn't for one moment say that would be enough by itself. I think you would still have to pay attention to what is situated and what is specific to the discipline, and at what level, because I think in one of the you know, comments the tutors made about, you know, you don't need to do a footnote on the source of this information, you know, in the example I cited. I think that may well be related to, for example, the level of study. You know, if someone, you know, in you know, at a BA level, well, if that is so commonplace, don't bother. But if you're talking to a general audience, you know, then maybe you need to. But the point about it is, you know, the situatedness, I think, is very important to this. It's part of that sensibility.
That's great. Thanks, Constant. Here's another question to throw at you, which is also thought-provoking, from Linda Taylor. Hi, Linda. Should our construct of good academic writing embrace an ability to write appropriately, not just for our peer community, but also to communicate effectively with a non-academic audience, for example, media, government, general public? Can this skill be learned or taught? Is this a sort of academic writing skill, is this sort of academic writing skill becoming urgent in an age that is information rich, but wisdom poor?
Hello, Linda. Tough one, thank you. Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think some of this is already happening. This, you know, the idea that you need to provide learning experiences in how to communicate complex, often expertise-based information to a wider audience. Well, at my college, for example, there's an increasing amount of attention, and, you know, the teaching staff are basically encouraged to incorporate communication skills into their modules, meaning different disciplines, if you like. And so, you know, increasingly we are also thinking about, in the assessment, one piece of it is not just the academic report or the essay or the assignment at the end of the module or midterm module or something like this, a midterm assignment or something like this, but also provide doing for example, a poster, and then an oral, as it were, set of commentary to do with a poster, to communicate to people who may not be actually in your field, in your discipline, and may not even be interested in what you're doing, but you want to entice them into your world and that sort of thing. So yes, I mean, I would imagine in the time to come, you know, we would be, in terms of academic writing, we would be thinking about progressively writing for others in the expert community, but also communicating, writing for wider audiences who may not, A, know a lot about your discipline or your topic, and B, who might not even be interested unless you can actually make the whole thing interesting and relevant to them. So yes, I would agree that is probably the next thing, but I can see beginnings of it already in curriculum development, and we're certainly seeing you know, quite explicit statements from on high about that. Sometimes it, you know, this sort of thing comes under in the guise of something called transferable skills, but actually this is what we're getting at. You're muted.
Sorry. I've done the whole cardinal sin that everyone's done. John, do you want to ask your question in your own words? You've asked us to put your camera on, so you can do so if you wish.
Okay. So, Constant, when I read your abstract, I got thoughts about the importance of reading, because how can you write academically if you do not have sufficient experience in reading academic text? And that goes in the wider sense as to be responding to Linda's question, in the wider sense that you can talk about these kind of subjects to a general public, but it is also in the more narrow sense that you can talk to your peers in your field. And I think the importance of reading is to broaden your horizon, because if you're just dependent on one tutor, you're also dependent on their idiosyncrasies and their specific ways of approaching things.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, well, no, I have no intention of underplaying or denying the importance of reading. In fact, I think in one of the earlier slides, I actually included reading as part of the mediation into the disciplinary knowledge. And of course, reading other people's writing would provide you with, if nothing else, actual experience and samples of how writing is done in those disciplines at a particular time. So no, far be it for me to say reading is not important. In fact, it's very important. But what it is I'm trying to get at is, in the way that you write, is yourself is enacting all that you have got from talking to the tutors, from talking to your fellow students, reading the papers that the tutors have asked you to read, and then you are then asked to write what you know, basically. So my focus is what we know. Far from not being important, reading is very important, I would say. And if I were giving a different talk, I would be saying, you know, reading is a key component of getting to know your discipline. Yeah. In fact, there's no amount of time in the world that's enough for you to talk to your tutors. They only see you for about, I don't know, an hour a week at the most. And when you talk to them, they give you 5 minutes most of the time, if that. So all that is, you know, just part of the journey. The real stuff is listening, the enactment, the drama of the lecture, the dynamic interaction and all the cognitive benefit that comes with talking with other people. And then you go read, or you read before and make, you know, bring what you read into the frame when you talk to your tutors. So the kind of building up of your, you know, your stock of knowledge, the schemata in your head of the discipline, I think that's all very much part of it. And without reading, I would say, I mean, I'm glad you brought up this point. Without reading, the talking is actually nonsense anyway, because you don't know what you're talking about most of the time, especially when you're a student learning to, you know, learning about a subject. You need to read to give you the background to understand the lectures. And that's why, for example, in lectures, we give pre-reading. So, you know, read something first before you come to the lecture. Otherwise, you know, it's all just a bunch of words that, you know, wouldn't connect with you. So yes, absolutely, John.
Thanks.
Right.
That's great. Constant, we've got a lot of interesting questions here. There was one actually about, you know, apprentice researchers and genre sensibility, which is an interesting one that in terms of prioritizing, maybe that's something that needs to be prioritized for sort of PhD level and early career researchers, which I presume you agree with.
See if I understand the question. Is it to do with, is the question about getting the genre right is very important for doctoral level work?
Yeah, I think it's about sort of coming up with priorities for English for general or specific academic purposes for undergraduate, postgraduate taught and postgraduate research students. I'm not sure if I've interpreted the question right, but there's so many competing priorities you know, so much to help them with in a way in terms of academic literacy building. Would you put genre sensibility up there as, you know, a very important one?
Right. Yes, I would say genre sensibility as a very important ingredient in coming to understand what counts as adequate content knowledge. Because genre is not just about, features of the text or the structuring of arguments within a text, whether it's written or spoken. Genre actually is much wider than that, the way I take it, instead of, obviously engaging with the partisan debate about, particular takes on genre. But the general idea, if I take from Swales, right, is really we're talking about a set of shared sensibilities. But that sensibility is not about anything other than, if you like, the kind of content and the practice within a particular discipline and within a particular location as well. Because when I say location, I don't mean a sort of like a particular place, but a kind of place and time when communities work together well and come to cohere together. And then they may obviously fall apart in over time and so on. But the point about it is, yes, it is a very important thing to have that sensibility. So it's not just about genre, it's not just about templates of text, nor is it about specific moves of arguments. But we've seen in the two short extracts that I show you that in fact it could turn against you if you think you need to give great details on every point. You actually you can incur some sort of negative sanction. A teacher says you don't have to say it because it is so obvious. But you wouldn't know, you wouldn't have that sensibility if you didn't get into that side of things. So yes, I think so. But it has to be a dynamic thing and understood as a kind of interaction of knowledge, of invocation of that knowledge by a more powerful person, and the requirements of display, and that's the textual part. And that part is only one part. That's all I'm saying. Okay, there are other things before you get to the text. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it's awfully complex, and there's lots at play here. I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll move to the last question. Constant, there have been some rich comments and suggestions of resources. So I will, ensure that you get a copy of all of these comments. So we'll come up to the last question here, again from Kilmars. If we agree that writing is in fact translating thinking into written form and agree with Nisbat's geography of thought, would there be any grounds for any universally true criteria of good writing?
Right. Well, I guess, what is good writing, I think, has to be set against the expectations, the values, the sensibilities of a particular disciplinary community at a particular time. And how we capture that, I think, is a matter of the practice of, if you like, professional development, the organization of knowledge in, through kind of subject associations, and obviously through the research community in a way that we produce research papers and things like that. So again, that is a different dimension involving, publishing, the journals, the university research teams, and the way, for example, research councils expect the outcomes to be reported. That itself is also a very powerful influence. So yes, there may well be, and I think that in practice there are often criteria for judgment, no question about that. But what I wouldn't want to say is that there are criteria that are either permanent or eternal. I think they are subject to change, just as the wider activity of scientific community and the social sciences shift and change. These things change with, you know, the writing side, the textual production side would change with that. Okay, so it may well be that is, you know, it is that we're talking about a kind of permanent redevelopment and revision of criteria, values, expectations, and norms. I think that's probably what we're looking at over time.
Yeah, quite selfishly, Constant, we're over time. Can I ask you the very last question here, which is, what is the implication of all of this for, you know, university entrance testing?
Right. Well, interestingly, I mean, well, two points. One is, you know, our friends in, for example, in New Zealand and many Australian universities now actually do their post-enrollment language assessment of all incoming undergraduate students. So what you're seeing then is, yes, they have university entrance criteria, but and they serve, if you like, recruitment and administrative purposes. But once landed, so to speak, students are assessed in relation to what the institution's own expectations and practices might require. And so, you know, many of our colleagues working in New Zealand actually are dealing with post-enrollment language assessment and then develop language support programs. And this is not just for international students. And so what they're saying is they recognize writing, academic literacy generally, actually reading and writing. You know, this point goes back to John's thing. I kind of steered away from the bigger issue of literacy because reading is part of it, but because the focus of the talk, I didn't want to kind of get too diffuse. But our colleagues in New Zealand and parts of Australia are already dealing with it. They're localizing it. So they're separating administration, recruitment, and pedagogy. So that's, you know, I think that's one thing that we can think about increasingly. And of course, I mean, you know, my colleagues, Ursula Wingate, for example, has done quite a bit of work in relation to working with the disciplines within the subjects, supporting students. So I guess a quick way of saying it is, whatever entrance requirement standards we set, that's only one part of the story. But in terms of pedagogy and curriculum development, we need to go local once students landed at our doorsteps. We need to do something more than just relying on that score, because that, I mean, we're seeing colleagues are dealing with it in, you know, in systematic ways already. And of course, you know, I'm not saying, you know, everything's wonderful just because you do post-enrollment assessment, but what it is, if we're seeing movement forward, as it were, to tackle this problem.
Thank you, Constant. On that note, I think we'll move to close the talk, but I want to thank, firstly, thank you, Constant. That was a really thought-provoking talk. And thank you all for attending this seminar. And this is the last one of our calendar year, but the Applied Linguistics and TESOL seminars will start up again in January. So please stay tuned for all of that. Thank you all very much. Great to see you all. Thank you.